Okay, so Channi, you can restart from where you left.
Okay.
So share your slides again. Okay, I will tell you when you have more or less 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
So I was about to introduce this metabolic parameter, and this is the derivation of the metabolic parameter and also a simplification thereof. So essentially there's two components in this metabolic parameter. One captures the wage basket in relationship to the labor coefficient and an optimum amount of nutrients that needs to be returned to the soil in order to sustain a level of fertility. This is captured by EA. And the second component is the inverse of labor intensity, which is what I formalize as this abstract concept in Marx's labor process theory, purpose realization. So since labor intensity appears both in the labor coefficient, which is adjusted for labor intensity, and in this fraction over here, I can rewrite this in terms of a component that expresses the material element of the metabolic parameter and the one that is related to purpose realization. And this is the result. And so essentially what we have here is a quadratic relationship between the material component and the metabolic parameter, which, as I said before, captures Marx's original observation on the relevance of nutrient cycles and the relevance of returning nutrients to the soil in order to perform sustainable agriculture. But it also captures in a microeconomic sense, the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis, which relates pollution to the level of economic development in a macroeconomic way. But in a microeconomic sense, I argue that material well-being of workers leads to a higher environmental performance up to a certain turning point, which is this optimum of nutrients returned to the soil. Now, the intensity of this quadratic material relationship with respect to the metabolic parameter is mediated by this element which more or less captures purpose realization, MPA. And so MPA, which is a function of labor intensity, decreases the sensitivity of this parameter with respect to the material component and also decreases the maximum value of the metabolic parameter when the material component is at its maximum equal to 1. So in the paper, I also introduced some comparative statics, which relate the change in the ecological surplus from the world ecology strand of eco-Marxism to the rate of profit. And I show in very simple graphs that increases in fertility can be seen as increases in ecological appropriation, which increase the ecological surplus and therefore also increase the rate of profit. Increases in the wage basket and therefore the wage rate have an ambiguous effect because it depends on which side of the hyperbole you're on, whether this increases ecological appropriation, so improves soil fertility, or decreases soil fertility with subsequent impacts on the rate of profit. Then I'll just show you. Oh, I thought I had a picture here. No. Okay, sorry. So increases in labor intensity, for example, that can be seen as an increase of labor appropriation. Since labor intensity, these increases result in a more efficient production process, but this is not compensated for in terms of what workers receive as part of the surplus. So temporarily, you will have that the ecological surplus goes up, the rate of profit goes up, but because I relate labor appropriation to ecological appropriation, ecological surplus also goes down, and the rate of profit also falls as a result of this relationship, the mediating relationship between the purpose realization element and the material component of the metabolic parameter. So yes.
Okay, in about 5 minutes, if possible, you should go. Okay.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. So the framework essentially captures the impact of appropriated ecological processes on production processes, acting on the technological coefficients instead of treating an ecological process or nature as an input. And through this, I highlight the role of both distribution and working conditions on the state of this appropriated ecological process. It also shows a parallel movement of the rate of profit and the ecological surplus. And in the end, it's a very simple alternative to the externalities-based or welfare economics-based microeconomic treatment in ecological economics. Of course, there are many open issues still that I'm still working on. One very important one regards the concrete measurement of appropriation. So it's difficult to kind of empirically verify appropriated ecological processes. Another is related to the fact that in my exposition of the way that environmental and resource economics treats economy ecology configurations, I highlight taxation, and I could also do the same in a neo-Ricardian framework. So I could extend the work by Gerke and Lage from 1995 that do some work on the impact of environmental taxes on distribution. And then one could argue what the role, or one could analyze what the role of this metabolic parameter is in relationship to capitalized ecological processes and attempts at its internalization. Then what I'm also working on is an extrapolation of this metabolic parameter to the broader issue of climate change, because the example that I introduce in the paper is based in the sphere of agricultural production. And what I have so far, this is very preliminary work, is to kind of use this metabolic parameter to capture the carbon intensity of consumption. And so what you have here is, again, a quadratic relationship between the level of material well-being and carbon intensity of consumption through the wage rate, but also the length of the working day, where EC in this case dictates a turning point beyond which higher material well-being increases the carbon intensity of consumption. Or you could argue that people engage more in luxury consumption, and I suggest this recent work by Stefano with a neo-Ricardian argument on that. We still have the negative relationship between labor intensity and working conditions in the sphere of production. This opens up a discussion on working conditions and the types of jobs that are desirable in a low carbon economy. And then finally, what I would also like to introduce is the labor intensity in the sphere of reproduction, which is a function of a kind of optimum amount of time that should be spent on social reproduction and the length of the working day, which then relates to a discussion on working time reduction and care work, a la the work done by Ciplinsky and Alessandro very recently. So thank you for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and comments.
Okay, thank you a lot, Chandni, in particular, for being very in time. You got perfectly in time. So I leave the ground to Jose Perez for the discussion.
Okay.
Jose, you have around 5 minutes.
Okay, I have 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations for the paper. I enjoyed reading it. I will just make some minor and some major comments, but I think at the end of the day, all of them are minor. Well, first of all, in page number 1, I could not write mainstream negligence of biophysical constraints superimposed on economic activity. Mainstream economics is concerned about biophysical constraint. Another issue is that we do not agree on how they deal with that, but I couldn't write that. Then another minor comment is that on page 14 you say that one of the factors inhibiting ecological economics from a more thorough critique of environmental economics is related to the emphasis of substitution between human-made capital and natural capital, while substitution between human-made capital and labor is blindly accepted. I agree with that. I agree that ecological economics is nowadays mainly marginalist. In fact, the journal Ecological Economics is a neoclassical journal. There is you should also point out that there is that ecological economics, as you later said in the paper, is heterogeneous, and there is a relevant body of ecological economics, of literature in ecological economics, questioning the marginalist paradigm. So just to mention some: Valero et al. 2008, Parrique et al. 2019, O'Neill 2018, Nieto et al. 2020, Hickel and Callis 2020. So there's a well, sometimes you have to be careful. And well, moreover, there is also increasing empirical literature proving that the green growth paradigm has proven to be an ineffective roadmap towards sustainability. So you can mention D'Alessandro et al. 2020, Hickel et al. 2020, Capellan Perez et al. 2020. There's a lot of literature on that. Some major comments, but I still think they're minor. Honestly, I think that pages 13 to 15, so 12 pages in the paper, are expendable. Why? You basically describe the logical inconsistencies of the neoclassical paradigm. And for that, you use an example. Honestly, I could simply write a paragraph indicating that the theoretical foundations of the aggregate production function of a weak cell suffer from the logical inconsistencies that derive from the conception of capital, and that ecological economics and environmental economics share the use of aggregate production function. So nothing more to say. I couldn't spend 12 pages saying that. I think that if you like to address an heterodox audience, honestly, I think that every professional economist knows that aggregate production function. Okay, and so 2 more comments. I will try to be fast. I do not entirely agree with the comment you make that says our incorporation of labor intensity allows us to capture an important determinant of labor exploitation without retorting to Marx's labor theory of value, which is considered to be incompatible with the Ricardian derivation of relative prices and redundant with respect to the explanation of positive profits. Well, I do not agree. Why? Because within, among other explanations, within a neo-Ricardian framework, Barcelona 1985 showed that the theoretical price ratio of 2 self-reproducing goods that predominantly use the same kind of input, let's say labor, as an example, is equal to the ratio between their specific surplus rates multiplied by the ratio between suitable quantities of these goods for a given distinguished or common input, let's say labor. And if labor is this distinguished input, then this theorem is perfectly congruent with the rational conception of the theory of value. Okay. And finally,
Jose.
Yes.
If possible, we reached the
yes,
the
I'm sorry. Just well, I will be very, very fast. Just the last comment is, I think, well, as I understood the model, you consider 2 commodities, one produced by the industrial sector and another one produced by the agricultural sector. Honestly, I would recommend you maybe for future research to generalize your model. So you have determined relative prices of goods that have a single phase reproductive period. I would consider goods with multi-periodic reproductive capacity. I could make you some comments to that, but I will send you a note because I ran out of time. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Jose. Thanks a lot.
it's just fine. So, Chandni, do you wish to answer to the comments?
Most of them have been very useful. Thanks. I will look into it. If you can send me some of the references that argue on this compatibility, because as I understand, some neo-Ricardians argue for the incompatibility, but then there's this stream of literature that highlights that this is not the case. So I'm very interested in exploring that more. And then with respect to some of the references you mentioned in terms of skepticism towards green growth, this stream of ecological economics, I completely agree with you. And I left them out specifically because their research is more macroeconomic. So I could definitely add a paragraph also in the presentation I managed that from the macroeconomic perspective, there's a growing heterodox stream in ecological economics as well. But yeah, that was not my focus in the paper. So that's why I didn't put much attention on that. And then on the 12 redundant pages, I agree with you in terms of having a heterodox audience, but this was not the audience that I had in mind, since what I try to ultimately achieve with the paper also is a bit more didactical and oriented towards students. So this is why I put so much effort in explaining the inconsistency across these 12 pages of the neoclassical framework. But for sure, I completely agree that for this audience, it's there's no need for it, absolutely. Thank you very much again.
Okay. Well, this said, congratulations for your paper, and I'm sure you have a brilliant future in this kind of research.
Thank you, Jose.
So, given that there are no questions either here or on Facebook, I just have a very quick comment. I don't know if you did not mention these references in the presentation or not. However, you may wish to consider, given the framework that you are using for analysis, for example, the contributions of Ken Benedict and also of Osoda. That are two neo-Ricardian authors that have been trying to handle more or less the same issues that you are handling. Therefore, perhaps their contributions as well can be useful to your analysis. Okay.
Thanks, Stefano. Which was the other author, Kemp Benedict and?
Eric Kemp Benedict and Osoda. I will.
Osoda. Yes.
I will
Osoda,
send the full references.
Yeah. Osoda works on waste and recycling.
Exactly. So, thank you a lot. We can move to the second round of presentations. However, before moving to the next presenter, I just apologize again with the entire audience for what seemed to be a sort of hacker attack that happened without any possibility for us to prevent it. Therefore, this being said, and having also reminded to the audience that you can send your comments also directly on Facebook by writing down in the below the live streaming. Now I leave the ground to the second presenter, Patin Alves Passoni, from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. And I ask Andrea Coveri to get ready for the comments after the presentation. So Patin, share the screen, share the PowerPoint. At the moment, we are not able to see the slides.
Can you see it now?
I do not. Okay. Now it seems to be working. Perfect. Please, okay. 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all you. I'm going to present now here part of my postdoctoral products of my previous year at here, where I'm doing my postdoctoral scholarship. I'm from Brazil. What I'm doing here in Mexico, this this program. So the paper I'm going to present is about the high-intense technological sectors in Mexico and Brazil. I'm going to do a comparative analysis is using input-output tables between 2000 and 2014. It's a little bit different from the previous presentation because it's more empirical one, but I think it's very connected with the whole idea of this program. So this is basically the overview of my presentation. I'm going to present some introduction and some theoretical framework, the methodology, and some results. Maybe I'm going to be, I thought that it was 15 minutes, so maybe I'm going to need less of time, but we're going to see. So the idea of comparing these two countries and specifically these two, this sector of greater capacity for technological discussion is because the literature associated with a more accelerated production and growth trajectories. For a long time, mainly the focus was only in manufacturing. However, several studies have also shown that some types of service, especially business service, also have this power to stimulate the productive activity. So to compare this or to find some evidence, I developed a structural decomposition analysis inside the input-output framework to identify the importance of mid-high and high technological intensity industry, to observe the change of gross production between the period I already mentioned is 2000 to 2014. The idea to compare Mexico and Brazil is because they are the biggest economies in Latin America. Also, they have leading position considering the domestic market. They are big economy, production and population, big two economies in Latin America. And together they correspond approximately 2/3 of Latin American GDP. So in order to identify the difference between these two the sectors of manufacturing and service of high technological intensity, I decompose the change of sector gross output according to three structural factors: the level of the type of demand, the production technique, and the trade pattern that I'm considering the composition of imports for intermediate and final demand. The general hypothesis of this paper is that there is a positive relationship between the importance of this sector of mid-high and high technological intensity industries and economic growth. This means that the higher the economic growth, the more we expect that the mid-high and high technological intensity industries have a better performance considering the share, but also the importance to justify the change in gross output. Also, we consider that other factors, for example, like the reduction in economic complexity related to technical coefficient, and also there is the increase in the share of imported inputs that is used to the production of the economy. The novelty of this research is because the previous study that compares Brazil and Mexico generally use qualitative input-output framework. Also, generally, they compare only the part of manufacturing. So I'm also comparing the manufacturing service of this medium high and high technological service based on a quantitative input-output model. The idea, or what I'm thinking behind all this, considering some theoretical framework, is that the classical development literature, the sector composition is an important factor to understand growth but mainly the rate of capital accumulation and economic development. So according to the Caldorian tradition, by Caldor, manufacturing is usually seen as the driver of economic growth and technological process because it has a static and dynamic economic scale. Considering the manufacturing production, this type of goods also have high income elasticity of demand, and they're usually traditionally considered having the potential to the catch up. Also from Caldor's second law, also known the Caldor-Verdun law, manufacturing output growth is positively related to the labor productive growth. So these are the main two laws of what is going. However, there's a lot of studies that have argued that some kind of service, especially business service, and the ones related to innovation, also have this whole. Initially, it was seen mainly for developed countries. However, there's a lot of studies that observing this also relating to developed countries like Brazil and Mexico. So the idea and the methodology, the structure, the composition is a well-known method in the input-output framework that analyzes the change of economic variable using a set of comparative statics changes in parameters of input-output table. So we'll depart here from a classical equation of the determination of gross output is equal to the inverse of length multiplied by the vector of gross final demand. That here is just a vector, but in the analysis I decompose this in all the components of final demand: household consumption, gross capital fixed formation, exports, and government consumption. So this is basically the general idea of the composition of the gross output. The trade pattern, I'm going to analyze the intermediate and final demand. Intermediate demand shows us how is the share, how the total technology change related to the share of important intermediate input to product, and also the final demand, if the final demand component is importing a higher share or a lower share of imported goods to attain the total demand. The technology is related to the change of technical coefficients of the economy. And here I consider total technical coefficient related to the domestic inputs that are used, but also the imported inputs. And then the total final demand is related to the total final demand, but also the demand of each final demand component. So usually we analyze the composition if it is positive or negative, because if it's negative, it is this share is contributing less to the change. We are decomposing here the change of gross output between 2 years. But also I decompose the change considering other two sub-periods, 2000 to 2008, 2010, 2014, to try to understand if there is some connection between the structural parameters, but also related to what is happening in terms of economic growth. So I use the world input-output tables, the most revision one. That's why the data is only up to 2014. I also classify the sectors considering the technological classification of OECD. So I'm considering this classification classifies the sectors of agriculture, manufacturing, service industry according to the average of sector expenditure realized in R&D. However, I know this classification is up to many criticism because it's usually based on developed countries. It maybe not reflect what is happening into medium income countries. However, this industry are classified into 5 categories: high, medium low, and low technological intensity, and also some sectors that is not classified, like education, public service, that may have connection with all sectors. I displayed the input-output table based on what suggests this author. Heisch is just considering a scholar, because in this paper I do not mess with relative price change, because due to the construction of the database and the differences between the national system of national accounts of countries. So these are the industries. There are 12 sectors for medium high technology, manufacturing, 5 for manufacturing, the other one for service, and 3 for high technological and manufacturing, chemicals and computer and electronic, and in case of services, scientific research and development. So I'm going to present you the results, some of the results. There are a lot of tables of the paper, but I'm going to highlight here the most important results. So together, these 2 type of industry, the medium high and high technological industries, represent a larger share of gross output in Mexico compared to Brazil. In Mexico, it corresponds approximately 18%, but it is reducing its share between 2000 and 2014 into percentage points. In Mexico, the sectors that have a higher importance are the one related to manufacture of motor vehicles, trailers, and some trailers that correspond to approximately 5%, and the manufacture of computer, electronic, and optical products. Also, when the automobile assembly sector is related to well-known process here in Mexico related to the maquilas. And also, it's very important to note that this sector related to motor vehicle is the only one that have increased its share in total gross output, especially since 2010, where United States transferred various operations and segments like premium categories to be produced here. However, we have to look, for example, at the proportion of value added and stuff. In Brazil, the share is approximately 13-14%, and also have reduced between 2000 and 2014. It is most focused on chemical products and electrical equipment, basic pharmaceutical products, and some computer and electronic products. Also, it is important to notice that the share of service, or the service of medium high and high technology service, represents a lower share in Mexico compared to Brazil. Is very important to notice. However, both economies between 2000, this period 2000 to 2014, have reduced the share of the total gross value of production and gross output, and this may indicate a loss in the importance of this sector in these countries. However, it is important to note that this fall is not constant across time. Between 2000 to 2008 is what the loss of the share is concentrated in Mexico, because it was a period of less growth in Mexico, and other sectors stimulated growth, not only that I'm going to say some factors more in a minute. However, in Brazil, this the reduction of the importance of this sector is more concentrated between 2010 and 2014. Here, I only analyzed the share as a basic static comparison. It's not the structure, the composition, but now I'm going to present you the results of the structural composition itself. Some results that we observe in the change of sector gross output. We also see here at the part of the structural composition. But the first thing is that the importance of the medium, high technological service tend to be pro-cyclical industry economy. So in Brazil, it's more important between 2000 and 2008. And here there is an importance, not only that the Brazilian economy grew more at this period comparative to the other one, 2010, 2014. But also because the growth in this period were more related to the change of gross fixed capital formation. That is one of the main final main component that is related to production of this type of goods. In Mexico, however, the importance is more obvious between 2010 and 2014 because this period, the economy was led by exports, and the production of this type of goods is more related to the export sector. However, we are dealing with here just in terms of gross output, not related to value added that is generated in the process. So I think I just said. So another important result of this that both economies they're more intensive. They're using more imported inputs in the process of production to attend not only total supply but also total demand. It is more intense for Mexico. For example, between 2010 and 2014, the share of intermediate imports using, for example, to produce exports grew between 40% to 55% of the imported inputs that's used in the production of exports. So it's very important, but it's also valid for Brazil. And considering the technology, the technical coefficients, there is a positive contribution of the sector to the growth. However, it means that the economy is being more related or more connected. However, the importance of this, because of the size of this technical coefficient, the contribution is very, very little for the economy. And also, I forgot to mention, but the process of the pro-cyclical relation is much related to the manufacturing sector other than service sector. And however, the service sector have increased in the importance to explain the change of gross output. In both countries, more in Brazil than Mexico, the share of, as we saw, 5% in Mexico and 20% in Brazil do not give the sector any importance to justify the change. However, there may be some indirect connections between them. Also, I think that we observe not directly related to the gross output, but in the change of structures of exports is that both countries, especially Mexico, have lost the ability to export high technological intensity products like pharmaceutical and electronic products. That is valid for both countries, and it's very important to notice that they're exporting more, for example, in case of Mexico, but in sectors that are more medium, high technological and not high technological activities. So that's basically what I have to share with you today. So if you have, I'm open to comments.
Okay, Patti, thank you. In the end, your presentation lasted exactly 20 minutes, therefore perfectly in time again. So, Andrea Coveri, if you wish, I leave you the ground for for 5 minutes for your comments and suggestions to put in presentation. Please.
Okay, here I am. Hi, everybody, and thank you for, first of all, thank you for involving me in this very nice event. And I have heard very interesting presentations until now, and I'm sure that I will be able to listen some other even further interesting presentation, even more interesting presentation in what follows. Thank you in particular, Patien, for presenting your paper. I quickly, let's say, took a look to it in the previous days, and I think that is, let's say, a very nice picture, a comparative picture of the, let's say, sectoral structure of the Mexican and Brazilian economies. And I also think that is a very nice, let's say, promising avenue to, let's say, to further develop this stream of research, in particular with regard to the development perspective of the Brazilian and of the Mexican economies. I have, let's say, just one major point about your work that I'm happy to, let's say, that you give me the possibility to, let's say, to appreciate, and then a couple of just, let's say, more formal minor points. The most important point, the most important issue that I would like to raise, and I hope that it can help you, let's say, to improve your work, or at least this is my intention, is the following. I think that it would be really interesting to, let's say, recompute and, let's say, to make the same exercise that you have already done in this work, but decomposing not the gross output, but the value added. The point is that, let's say, as you also mentioned in your work, in a world that is in which, let's say, global value chains have a great relevance, in which you have economies that participate a lot, in particular, the Mexican economy after the NAFTA agreement and in the second half of the 90s, but also for sure, this is true for what regards Brazil. You know that in a world in which you have a strong geographical dispersion of production, and in which intermediate cross borders multiple times before, let's say, being embodied in the final products, or if you want, before meeting the flows of final demand. Well, in this world, you have, if you want, a growing gap between the flows of gross output and between the flows of value added. And the amount of value added that is included, that is embodied within the gross output flows, can change, let's say, in a very relevant way. So you may observe, for example, an expansion of the medium high and high technology sectors in an economy in terms of gross output, but at the same time, it may be that the domestic value added that is generated within that economy, or if you prefer, the amount of domestic value added that is captured domestically by the actors that are located in a given economy, can be rather different. This is due in particular to the amount of, let's say, of foreign value added that is included within the production of some sectors, And due to this, the dynamics of the, let's say, gross output of sectors, in some cases, might be really misleading. This is also true for what regards the components of the final demand, in the sense that you may, let's say, you may find that an increasing flow of domestic final demand has a very large contribution for what regards the expansion of these kind of sectors. But at the same time, it may be that the amount of foreign value added that is generated elsewhere, in particular in, let's say, advanced economies that control, that orchestrate the value chains, and that capture the largest share of the value added because they control the, let's say, global value chain, they perform the global value chain activities that are able to capture a larger share of the value added of the final product. Well, you may find that an increasing, I was saying, that an increasing, for example, final demand, domestic final demand, doesn't translate, or maybe you can see that it translates in a growing gross output, but at the same time, maybe it is not going to translate in a greater value added from the domestic economy. That is the dimension in which you are really interested in from a development perspective. Since you are, let's say, interested in understanding how an economy is able to retain domestically, let's say, the value added that is needed for, let's say, for further investments and development, and for sure that is going to be divided in profits and wages, and then you go on, let's say, distributional discussions in which I'm not going to, let's say, to go into the details. Stefano, you were you saying something?
Yeah, we have 1 minute
Finish
left.
the time. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I'm going to close. So I think, to conclude, that the exercise that Patien does in his work is really interesting. I would like to see what happens in the moment in which you are going to compute the same statistics in terms of value added, for the reasons that I explained, sorry, really briefly and in a rather rough way. This is also related to the, let's say, industrial policies that countries can put in place for development. There is a large debate about, let's say, import substitution industrialization that then moved from there to export-oriented industrialization, and then, let's say, with the rise of global value chains, with the model of vertical specialization industrialization. If I can suggest you an author that you do not mention in your work, but I'm sure that you know him, that is William Milberg, that is the Dean of the New School for Social Research, that, let's say, has written a lot about this stuff. I think that you may enjoy. I enjoy reading him.
Andrea, I'm sorry.
I have to close, and
Yes.
I close saying that it would be also. It seems Italians like long speech. Well, okay, I'm going to close here because someone, let's say, found my speech quite boring, and I'm sure that he is right.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Patin, if you wish to answer to some comments, I ask you to be quite brief. Okay, we have to leave the ground to the last presentation.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm very glad to hear the interest in Andrea in my work. I'm actually working on this right now. So maybe in a couple of months, I can send you the paper related to the work I'm doing about the value-added decomposition. However, it's a little bit more complex to do because of the foreign trade. There are some databases that Brazil and Mexico have some compatibility. So taking, comparing two countries a little bit difficult because of the database. But still, I have the paper. I will gladly send to you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much again.
Thank you also to the second presenter and the second discussant. Now we can move to the last presentation of this first half of the workshop. Therefore, I leave the ground to Daniele Girardi from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Daniele, if you wish, you can share the screen and the slides. And I ask to Riccardo Summa, that will be the discussant, to get ready in order to comment on the presentation later. So Daniele, as before, 20 minutes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Let me look at that. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Stefano and the other people who organized this. It's really, I'm really glad to participate to this celebration of Pierangelo Garegnani, and I actually would like to start by paying homage to this giant of economic thought that was Pierangelo Garegnani. I'm really honored to be able to participate in a celebration of his life and work. This work that I would like to present it's really a work in progress. It's preliminary. I have a research question and some ideas about how to answer it, and I have some preliminary results, but it's not a complete paper yet. So I can really benefit from your feedback and comments. The big question underlying this work is about the potential trade-offs between equality and growth, and in particular, possible negative effects of egalitarian redistribution on private investment. And in this work, I focus on what I consider a very important case study, the 1981-1983 French Socialist experiment. The French Socialist experiment was one of the most ambitious pro-labor and egalitarian redistribution programs ever implemented in a liberal democracy, at least after 1945. And in this work, I want to study whether the French Socialist experiment depressed private investment. This hypothesis that this policy platform that was implemented, very progressive policy platform that was implemented by the French government, depressed private investment, is very popular in the literature. And interestingly, there seems to be convergence between more conservative, free market economists and Marxists on this topic, because the idea, that in a capitalist economy you cannot redistribute the income too much, otherwise it's going to harm growth, is something that fits the priors of both free market economics, but also Marxist economics, with the idea of structural constraints of capitalism. And so to test this hypothesis empirically in this work, I used both existing aggregate data and a new firm-level data set that I have been building from archival sources, and it's not actually complete yet, but I already have some preliminary results. In particular, the idea is to use stock market prices to measure the impact of the French Socialist experiment. The audio is not good. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Perhaps, I don't know, you can try to get a bit closer to the microphone.
Yes, I can also try to speak louder.
Okay.
Is it better? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I will just be louder. So yeah, the idea is that to use stock market prices to measure the impact of the French Socialist experiment on expected profitability of firms, both on aggregate and how this impact was distributed across firms and sectors, and then to use both aggregate and firm-level data to try to estimate an effect on investment. So let me first give a brief outline of the French Socialist experiment. In spring 1981, a socialist-communist coalition took power in France. They won both presidential and parliamentary elections, so they basically had full power in France. And they immediately proceeded to implement a pretty radical redistribution program that had been clearly spelled in their electoral program. And they were pretty consistent in the first year to implement this program, which had four main pillars. Progressive tax policy, they created a new wealth tax. They raised income taxes on firms and on high incomes. The second pillar was labor market policies. They increased the minimum wage steeply, and they decreased the work week for equal pay, and they decreased the retirement age. The third pillar was nationalizations. They nationalized major financial and industrial groups. They basically nationalized almost the entire financial sector and the biggest industrial groups. And the fourth pillar was a Keynesian element, because all this platform implied a large fiscal expansion. So this experiment ended in March 1983. The country was experiencing slow growth, high inflation, and a currency crisis at that point. And the socialist president Mitterrand decided to reshuffle the government, and he said, enough with the socialist experiment, it's not being sustainable from a macroeconomic point of view, and they made their famous U-turn. So after that, they turned, even with the same party in power, although the communists exited the coalition, but the socialists remained in power, but they turned to austerity and supply-side policies, and actually after that event, the French Socialist Party became one of the most neoliberal socialist parties in Europe, from being one of the most socialist. So the rise and fall of this French socialist experiment and the subsequent U-turn to austerity and supply-side policies has been one of the most influential events in recent European and global economic and political history. For example, Ravi Abdelal, who is a major scholar of the politics of globalization, in his work, he sees this episode as the single most influential event that shaped the ideological shift of left parties in Europe and leading them to embrace more conservative politics. So, unsurprisingly, there is a rich literature already on the French socialist experiment, although so far it has been mainly descriptive and non-quantitative. So in this paper, I'm trying to offer a quantitative angle on this. And in this literature, there is a consensus broadly on the fact that the French socialist experiment caused a sort of capital strike. So this capital strike hypothesis is actually pretty straightforward. It says that this platform of progressive redistribution lowered the expected profitability of the French business private sector, and this led to lower private investment, and lower private investment contributed to an economic crisis and to a stagnating economy. So this is considered one of the main factors, together with the external imbalances, that caused the failure and reversal of the socialist experiment. Now, this hypothesis of a capital strike, of a negative effect of these progressive policies on private investment, is mainly based on a time series graph of investment in France. And indeed, if we look at this graph, which shows a business investment in France, and the first vertical line marks the beginning of the French socialist experiment, and the second one marks the U-turn, the end of the experiment. Indeed, there is a striking correlation between investment stagnation and the French socialist experiment. Clearly, this coincided with the stagnation of private business investment in France. However, the problem with this time series evidence is that it doesn't provide a counterfactual, doesn't tell us what would have happened to investment in France in the absence of a socialist experiment. And this is important also because the early 1980s were years of a global recession, were the years of the Volcker shock coming from the US, the US raising interest rates by a lot and causing a global recession. So we shouldn't take it for granted, I think, that this investment stagnation was caused by the internal politics of France versus a global environment that was contributing to depressing investment possibly. So in order to answer this question more in detail and try to have some counterfactual for what would have happened without these policies, I'm collecting a data set that has three main components. The first is share prices on Paris Stock Exchange, and this is both an aggregate index with all tradable shares in the, so it's a stock market index for the Paris Stock Exchange. But I've also been digitizing firm-level data from the Le Monde newspaper that every day was publishing stock market valuations, because capitalists in the morning want to read how their stocks are going. So luckily, we have this information, and I've been able to access it and digitize it to create a firm-level data set so that I can see what firms and what sectors, if anything, were impacted by these policies. The second part of the dataset is firm characteristics and outcomes, and here there are a few sources. The only one that was already in electronic format is the WorldScope dataset, which is a dataset with financial statements of firms. However, the WorldScope dataset has a very small sample for that period, and so I've been working on collecting other data from archival sources. In particular, there was a publication called Europe's Largest Companies that was published every year with the 20,000 largest companies in Europe. And this is only on paper, so there is a big work to be done to digitize it, and it's not ended yet. And so the results I will present will actually be based on the firm-level share prices that I digitized from Le Monde, from the WorldScope dataset, but not yet from this other publication. And third, aggregate macroeconomic data from the OECD Economic Outlook. Now, the first part of the work, of the empirical work here, is to use stock market returns around the 1981 election, which triggered the French socialist experiment, which put the socialist communist coalition in power in France, look at stock returns around the election in order to assess the expected impact of the French socialist experiments on French firms. This exercise relies on the assumption that the electoral result of the 1981 election was a surprise, because only if we assume that the result of the election was unexpected, only in that case we can use stock market prices after the election to measure the reaction, because otherwise, if the result was expected, then its implications would have already been priced into the stock market. So to understand if this assumption that the election result was not totally anticipated is plausible, I collected in this table that I'm showing here the results from all voting expectation surveys taken before the May 1981 presidential runoff. So these were surveys in which people were asked, would you think will win the election? And what we can see here is that the conservative candidate and incumbent president, Giscard d'Estaing, was leading the socialist candidate Mitterrand by double digits. So that means people didn't really anticipate socialist victory in that election. So this evidence supports the assumption that this electoral victory constituted a surprise. And so we can look at the stock market reaction in the days after the election to see what was the expected impact of these policies, of this French socialist experiment on firms. This graph shows the index of stock market prices in France. So this is the average value of French firms that are listed on the Paris stock market around the election. So the vertical red line is the day before the election, the last trading day before the election. And for comparison, I'm also showing the United States Standard & Poor's index. So this graph clearly suggests that there was a large negative effect of the socialist electoral victory on the value of French firms. Average valuations on the Paris Stock Exchange fell by almost 30% in the 15 trading days after the election, and the timing of this fall in share prices, which happened straight after the election, in the first day after the election, we have the biggest fall in share prices, it clearly suggests that this was the effect of the election on the value of French firms. So using the data that I digitized from the Le Monde newspaper at the firm level, I can disaggregate the stock market fall at the sectoral level to see what sectors were expected to be impacted most by this change of government. And I see that there is substantial variation in the impact of this event across sectors. At the two extremes, you can see here foreign firms listed in Paris were the only ones having positive returns in the 2 weeks after the election, which makes sense because these firms were not really affected. These were firms that were not based in France, but they were just listed in the Paris Stock Exchange. At the other extreme, firms that had been targeted for nationalization in the socialist electoral platform, they displayed the largest fall in share prices. But also in between these two categories of firms, there is substantial variation with, for example, firms in the food and beverages sector having much smaller decreases in share prices relative to, for example, the utilities or natural resources sectors or the financial firms. Now, matching the stock market data at the firm level with data on firm level characteristics, I can also test if there is systematic variation in the impact of this political change on the value of firms based on firm characteristics. And these 4 graphs summarize my results on this. And they show that, so this first graph on the left, on the upper panel on the left, it shows that firms that were more export-oriented, firms that depended more on exports, they had larger decreases in share prices, so they were hit harder. Also, more firms with higher labor intensity, they had bigger decreases in share prices. Larger firms too, and more profitable firms too. So this analysis is controlling for sector fixed effects. So basically, I'm only looking at variation within sectors. I'm comparing firms with different export orientation, labor intensity, and so on, but only comparing firms within the same sector. So this doesn't just capture sectoral effects, but it's based on comparing firms that belong to the same sector but are different from the point of view of these four characteristics.
Daniele?
Yeah.
If possible, I will ask you in some minutes to finish with the presentation.
Okay, how many minutes do I have left?
4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, 4 or 5 minutes is ample time to finish. Thank you. Okay, so this was the first part of analysis that I have done, in which I have looked at the stock market prices after the election to see what was the expected impact of the French socialist experiment on firms, on different sectors, different types of firms. The second step is to use aggregate data to evaluate the effect on private business investment. And this aggregate analysis uses a synthetic control method. So in brief, synthetic control means that I build a counterfactual for France, which tells us what would have happened. It's our best guess of what would have happened to France in the absence of the French socialist experiment. And this counterfactual is built as a weighted average of other advanced economies. with weights that are selected optimally by the synthetic control algorithm. My main outcome of interest is private business investment, but I also look at other aggregates to get a more comprehensive picture of the effect of the French socialist experiment on the French economy. So I look at also at real GDP, equity values, inflation, and imports as a share of GDP. So let me first show results on GDP, inflation, imports, and equity prices. So how do you read these graphs? In these graphs, the solid line is the actual time series of these aggregates in France. So the solid line tells you what actually happened in France. The dashed line is my best guess based on the synthetic control analysis of the counterfactual. It shows, so the dashed line is meant to represent how these variables would have evolved without a socialist experiment. It's actually built as a weighted average of what happened in other advanced economies that didn't have a socialist experiment. And the first vertical line here, the red one, is 1980, just before the socialist experiment, and the second vertical line shows you 1983, when the experiment was reversed with the U-turn to free market policies. So here we can see in panel A that GDP actually grew in line with the counterfactual during the socialist experiment itself. However, it did somewhat fall behind after the U-turn, probably because of the contractionary effects of austerity policies implemented after 1983. In panel B, we can see that the socialist experiment increased inflation in France relative to similar comparable countries. In panel C, we see a very large effect on imports, on the imports to GDP ratio. This is probably due to the expansionary fiscal implications of the French socialist experiments. So this basically shows that as a result of the French socialist experiment, imports in France grew much faster than in other advanced economies. And in panel D, we see a negative effect on equity prices, which just confirms what we have already seen with the firm level stock market data. So far, regarding these outcomes, the picture that emerges from this synthetic control analysis is kind of similar to what has been the descriptive account of the French socialist experiment, which has been seen as inflationary and as causing balance of payment problems for France. But my main outcome of interest is private business investment, and results on this variable are shown here. And here results are a bit less in line with the conventional account of the French socialist experiment. Yes, 1 minute. There is very little evidence based on this exercise of a negative effect on private business investment. If anything, it seems like France outperformed the counterfactual during the years of the French socialist experiment, while it underperformed after the U-turn to free market policies. But these effects, they're quite small, they're not statistically significant. So overall, the main message from this analysis of the effect of private business investment is that there is no evidence of any substantial negative effect of the socialist experiment itself, and this is, not really in line with the capital strike hypothesis that has been talked about in the literature. So it's time for me to conclude. So I just want to mention that I have another analysis that is very preliminary, and it estimates again these effects on investment, but by using firm level data, comparing French firms with firms from other OECD countries. This analysis so far is on a very limited sample, only firms that are in the WorldScope database. I hope to be able to have a larger sample size when I have new data sources that I'm digitizing that I mentioned before. But so far, what I find with this limited sample is consistent with the synthetic control analysis. In panel A, you can see a negative effect on profitability. So basically, the profitability of French firms fell behind the profitability of firms in other rich economies during the French socialist experiment. However, investment didn't. There is no sign that investment fell behind. It actually remained in line with other advanced economies. So both the results from the synthetic control analysis and this firm level analysis suggest that actually investment stagnation in France during the French socialist experiment was in line with the investment stagnation that other advanced economies were experiencing, probably because of global economic shocks, and so that suggests there is no evidence that this was the result of a negative effect of the French socialist experiment on business investment. I will conclude here because I think I'm probably, I think probably out of time now, and I look forward to your comments, critiques, and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniele. Riccardo, if you're ready, the floor is yours for the comments.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you very much for the.
I ask you to be to remain within 5 minutes. Okay.
Of course, yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me, and also to Danielle for this very interesting presentation. Danielle is still owing me the paper, the draft, so I just have access to the presentation. I have some dots, which some of them I still continue because it was a quick presentation. My first specific comments, maybe you have 2 papers or even 3, because you have this macro paper about the investment share, the falling trend of investment share, and what happened in the 81 and 83. You have this micro paper relating the firms in the investment at the firm level and the expected profit rate, and maybe something about the impact of elections on the expected profitability. So I'll start with the macro level. Falling, you can see that there's a falling trend of investment share since 1975. No. Another thing that I look at the data, and you have this stable capacity utilization in industry. So how can you have capital strike or investment strike and a stable capacity utilization if the economy is still growing, and in fact you have this kind of strike, you'll see a higher, or even the capacity will reach 100% in a short period of time. I'm in doubt about this synthetic France. Did you use a model or some kind of accelerator to compare this model? I know you have with Ricardo a paper where you estimate an accelerator for France and other countries. From the micro, you didn't enter this part, but maybe it's good to make a comparison between the normal profit rates and the actual profit rates. Sometimes in this literature, these concepts are mixed. I don't know how you can tackle this empirically, but I think at least you can discuss a little bit this kind of 2 different concepts. Another question: how do you compare micro, the investment at the micro level, because you can have changes in market share. So maybe one firm is not, even if demand is growing, one firm is not investing because it's losing market share to the other. So how can you do this comparison? I understand at the macro level, but at the micro level, it's not so easy. Here is the capacity utilization in industry in France. So you have a quite stable compared to other to business cycles, etc. So it's maybe you can also expose this, or at least in a more disaggregated way for the industry. I'll have 1 minute for my last comments on Kalecki and Garegnani and capital strikes. There's this idea you said in some Marxists, there's this also in Streck, the idea that there's investment strike. This is related to Kalecki, but you know, Kalecki say that capitalists do many things as a class, but they certainly do not invest as a class. So you also have Garegnani in the first papers published in Europe about the tendency for the economic capacity to adjust to the long period effective demand. And also another not so known paper by Garegnani, in which he relates the idea that there's no investment strike in the sense of economics, but there's a political attempt to change the macroeconomic policy stance, and then to change towards austerity, etc., which then will lead to a fall in investment. There's no economic reason to expect investment strike from these Garegnani and Kalecki perspectives. So there's a political and not economic aspects of full employment, which leads to the discussion about what is about capital strike. Is it investment strike or production? I have to finish now.
Yeah, Riccardo, please, I ask you to be very, very, very brief.
Okay, so that's it.
Okay.
I'll finish.
Thank you. So, Daniele, before answering to the comments of Riccardo, there is one additional question from the chat from Professor Levrero. A capital strike may happen also by means of a capital outflow. What happened to capital movements before the rise in French interest rates in 1983?
Yeah, I'll start by taking this question, but first I would like to ask how much time do I have?
If possible, less than 5 minutes. So we have a short break of 5 minutes, and then we start with the second session, the round table session.
5 minutes, you say?
Slightly less than 5 minutes, if possible.
I will try to do 4. Stop me after 4 minutes, okay?
Okay.
Stop me without any problem. So yeah, that's a great question. There was definitely a capital strike if we define it as capital outflows. Yes, that happened. Like that's why France experienced a currency crisis because of the French socialist experiment, and I think that's a fact. I think that's indisputable. What I'm asking here is whether that had a negative effect on the fixed investment of firms. So whether the capital outflow and the currency crisis had a real impact on the investment choices of firms, and I didn't find evidence of that. So then, okay, I want to turn to Riccardo's questions, comments. First of all, thank you so much, Riccardo, and I apologize again that I didn't have a detailed draft to share with you. So I understand that maybe not everything was super clear, but it seems like, your comments were great. So that means you were able to, to understand what I'm doing anyway. And the point about capacity utilization, that's not unexpected that capacity utilization kept up. Because France implemented a large fiscal expansion during the French socialist experiment. So what the capital strike hypothesis says is that even though demand was high, and so capacity utilization was, remained high, while it was decreasing, I'm pretty sure in other OECD countries, investment didn't respond as expected to the fiscal stimulus. And so that's, the idea of the capital strike is that even though demand was being stimulated, investment didn't follow because of the policies that were decreasing profitability, which, according to some, can have an effect on investment. For example, if investment is constrained by the availability of internal funds, so that lower cash flows because of higher labor costs and higher taxes on firms can have a negative effect on investment through that channel, for example. But I totally agree that, there are ways to explain these results, and we shouldn't necessarily expect a capital strike. And that's, as you said, we can find the explanation explanation consistent with the works of Garegnani and Garegnani that you mentioned, because Garegnani, talked about business using politics to react against expansionary policy, but he never said firms would withdraw investment. So sometimes Garegnani is associated with the idea of the capital strike, but he actually said firms, would have some sort of collective action in politics against expansionary pro-labor policies, but individually they have to, their economic interests doesn't allow them to decide their investment based on politics, but they do it based on economic considerations. I think I'm probably out of time, so I will just thank you and also Professor Levrero for his question. I will thank everybody for your attention. Okay. And thanks again, Stefano, for organizing and inviting me.
Thank you, Daniele. I just point out to you the fact that in the chat there is another question. Now we do not have time to answer it. However, it is there if you wish to answer to the person who asked it, Moib Ali.
Thank you.
So, thank you again to everyone. Now we have a very short break of 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, we start with the second session. That is a round table that will be moderated by Riccardo Pariboni. So, thank you again to all the presenters, to all the discussants, and see you in 5 minutes for the second part of the workshop.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. And in particular, let me thank the speaker that I will introduce soon. So first of all, let me say that we are very sorry for what happened at the very beginning of the first session. We suffered apparently from an hacker attack. So we are trying to do the best to prevent another occurrence of something like that. Well, you know, these kind of things happen, and let's hope we don't have another surprise like that. It will be really, really unpleasant. So, first of all, let me say that I'm deeply happy and honored to have the opportunity, and again, the honor to introduce Mark, Matthias, and Antonella to this hopefully very interesting round table. So, as advertised, we will have this discussion with Mark Lavoie, Matthias Vernengo, and Antonella Stirati. I will try to give you very, very minimal inputs in order to not waste any time and leave you the floor. So my proposal will be to organize and structure the roundtable in such a way that we have 2 rounds of intervention for the 3 of you, okay? So I will say 2 rounds, 15 minutes each for each of the 2 rounds. For the first one, I will propose to do in alphabetical order. So we have Mark Lavoie, then Antonella Stirati, and then Matthias Vernengo, and then we move from there, so to speak. So for the first round, I will just ask you to share your thoughts, your opinion about Garegnani legacy, about Garegnani cultural and theoretical legacy. What can we learn? And I mean, perhaps more importantly, what have we learned and where do we move from there, perhaps? So this is really the very basic stimulus I would like to give you, and I leave you the floor straight away. Please, Mark, the floor is yours.
Ricardo, can we present PowerPoints or?
Absolutely, absolutely. So please share your screen.
Yeah, but where do I do that?
At the bottom, sorry, my fault. At the bottom of the page, there is this symbol of an arrow pointing upwards.
Yes, okay.
Present now.
Okay.
Then you can select, I will suggest selecting the whole screen.
Okay, just a sec. I'll start again. It's of course, for me, it's in French, so a bit different.
You can either share one Windows or the whole screen. Perhaps the second option is easier.
Okay, infinite. Okay, let me try again. No, okay.
Yeah, it's coming.
No, it's going.
Perfect.
Yeah, but okay.
You should open, I think.
Okay, sorry. Right. So, well, first I should say that I met Pierangelo Garegnani only 3 times. I was at the Trieste Summer School in 1984. I met him, I think, I'm not exactly sure, at the History of Economic Society conference in Toronto in 1988. And in fact, this is when he told us that the journal Political Economy that he was running would not run for much longer. And then I saw him in 2010 at the SRAFA conference at Romatre, where he was in a session with Sheffield And this led to my presentation called "Should Straussian Economics Be Dropped Out of Post-Keynesian Economics?" and then to a chapter that was in one of the 3 books of the conference. And what I'm going to talk about is a file that I had kept for perhaps 30 years, because I think it I wrote about it. I had a 2-page document that I wrote around 1990, which was a sort of outline. And the title of this outline was...
Mark, sorry if I interrupt. I'm terribly sorry. We cannot see the slides, actually. So we are giving a look at your desktop. Perhaps you have to click on the presentation or something like that. Sorry, I really didn't want to interrupt the part about...
No, but...
No, for a second we could. For a second we could.
So, yeah. I had a similar problem when I presented for the Levy Institute. Okay, I'll say stop this. I'll start again. No.
Santiago Gan is the only one that can see the slides.
That's bad news.
Good for him.
I don't know why. If I say share.
Okay.
But
now
then
we see. Okay,
No,
now
we
you are
see-
sharing your.
This is very meta now. We're seeing ourselves.
No,
Okay.
yes, that's the meta universe Zuckerberg. No, but I think that was promising because we were seeing your screen. So if you open your PowerPoint at that point, we should see the presentation. I think we were going in the right direction.
How about now? No?
Not yet.
Okay, well, I guess you won't see the PowerPoint and I'll have to just talk about it.
Okay, don't worry. It will work.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry,
Yeah.
no, sorry.
Riccardo, sorry to interrupt. Perhaps Mark can send you the PowerPoint and you can share it.
Absolutely.
It tells you.
Absolutely, Mark, please. If you want, you can send me the slides and I will share them for you.
All right.
If I'm capable, which is still to be determined.
Okay.
Sorry for the delay.
No.
Give us just a few seconds.
Oh, no. Whoops. I think I sent the wrong one.
Wow.
I sent you the program, no? Okay, let me try again.
No, I think you sent me the PowerPoint.
Okay, good. All right.
Okay, just the last second. So, okay, let me share then my screen. What about now? Can you see Mark's slides?
Yes. Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay, please, Mark. I'll try to catch up with your talk.
Okay, but yeah, but I don't see you anymore. All right. So you had slide number 2, which was background.
Yes.
So in that outline, I had a list, a group of 7 ideas that represented to me the main ideas that Garegnani was putting forth, at least up until that time, around 1990. So now you can move to slide number 3. So those are the ideas of Garegnani from number 1 to number 3. So the first one is linked to capital controversies and reswitching. And basically, it was Garegnani criticizing papers that had been written around this issue. So there was the criticizing the paper of Samuelson of 1962 that was published in 1970 in the Review of Economic Studies, but that was 1963 when he wrote the first draft. Then he was part of this symposium on 1966 on Lévary, claiming that there couldn't be a reswitching. And then he had another one in the American Economic Review in 76, where he was criticizing Galloway and Shukla, who had made a similar claim about reswitching. Then I think his second major idea was his distinction between the short term, or the short period, and the long period, which came from his book in Italian, published in 1960. It was translated into French in 1980, but part of the book was also translated in a journal called Économie et Société in 1967. And Gennaro, there was even the translation of the debate that he had with Graziani. So the idea was that, well, Walras and Wicksell are mistaken in the long term. There's this idea that the long term should be related to the uniform rate of profit, a rejection of any long-term theory based on supply-demand analysis, and of course he was pushing forward in favor of the classical surplus theory. And then again, especially in a chapter that was published in a book by Brown and Zabrinka, there was this idea that general equilibrium theory was not even valid in the short term. Why? Because competition forces would bring about a uniform rate of profit, and you couldn't take that into account, or general equilibrium theory couldn't take that into account. And his complaint that general equilibrium theory was now based on expectations and temporary equilibria, and therefore that these dynamics provided no definite result. So we can move to the fourth slide. So the number 4 to number 7 ideas that I had identified. So what were the consequences of the capital controversies? So in his paper in the Review of Economic Studies, 1970, he outlined these for the theory of value. Then in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, for the theory of labor demand. But this came from a paper that he had already written 16 years before in 1962, but in Italian. So the Cambridge Journal of Economics was a translation of that. Then again, the Brown and Zabrinka paper and the Oxford Economics papers of 1984, he outlines the ideas around gravitation and natural prices. So he claims there should be a new notion of equilibrium, one without full employment. Then he presents his notion of the core, that the core of analysis is the price system, and that the quantities are taken from somewhere else. And that somewhere else, of course, is the theory of effective demand. And also in those two articles, he debates with Joan Robinson about the relevance of comparisons, because Joan Robinson already at that time was moving towards historical time, denying that one could do any economic analysis through logical time. And And then the sixth main idea is, how does this relate to the general theory and to Keynes? And so again, this is the article published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So his main point was the real critique that should have been done but was not done by Keynes is that there is no inverse relationship between the interest rate and the stock of capital, or between the interest rate and the level of investment. And so looking at the money side, he emphasized that for Keynes, the liquidity preference theory was an afterthought, because if the rate of interest was not the variable that was equilibrating the supply and demand for loanable funds, then the interest rate had to be determined in some other way. But this was introduced in Keynes' research, if you want, at a later stage, around 1934. And so he was criticizing Keynes. He thought, well, for Keynes, if there is an employment equilibrium, it's either because the interest rate is rigid downwards, or because investment is completely inelastic with respect to the rate of interest. So that was his view of Keynes. And then finally, the seventh idea was about the determination of the normal rate of profit. So along with other Sraffians, he rejected the idea of the Cambridge equation, which said that the rate of profit was equal to the rate of growth divided by the propensity to consume out of profits, or by the capitalist, if you take the Pasinetti version. And already in the paper, in the Oxford Economic Paper of 1984, and in the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 1979, when he responded to the critique of Joan Robinson, a very short critique, it was maybe a couple of pages by Joan Robinson, and Garegnani had something like a 5 or 6 page reply, where he is saying, well, there's nothing wrong with adopting Sraffa's hint that the normal rate of profit depends on the rate of interest set by the monetary authorities. And maybe I can finish with the fifth slide, which is the last slide. So up to now, I've talked about how I was seeing Garegnani's ideas up to 1990. So what about today? How can we see these things? So I have 3 points. The first one about the capital controversies. Maybe I'll say something controversial here. Perhaps the critique that has been done by Anwar Sheikh already in 1974, or in the book by Felipe and Macombi in 2013, has more relevance today when criticizing neoclassical production functions. Their argument, as many of you know, is that testing neoclassical production functions in values simply reproduces the national accounts, and so there's no way you can test the validity of these neoclassical production functions. On investment theory, well, along with many others, I discovered this part of Garegnani's report in Italian that was made in 1962, and that was translated into English in the Review of Political Economy 6 years ago. And I find that the paper is very interesting and very much modern, in the sense that the way he describes investment is that it depends on the growth or expected growth of final demand and on technical innovations. So this looks very much like a Kaleskian view of investment. And then he has this very interesting discussion about the influence of real wages on investment and also on exports. And at some point he says there is no reason that an increase in real wages must lead to a decrease in investment. So here he was denying the possibility of a profit-led in demand. And then on consumption theory, there is this article, I put the wrong date here, it's Graziani and Trezzini in 2010, is that they argued that during the transition, the cycle will affect the propensity to consume, and hence will affect the trend rate of growth, the level of capacity, and the rate of utilization. So this is a version of Garegnani that we are not used to, in the sense that, once again, he's got some kind of path dependence here, which is very much emphasized by the other post-Keynesians. And you can find that in two works, the two works that I mentioned there, in the book edited by Kregel, and in another book on the Traverse of 1992. And those two works, in fact, arise from the Trieste conference in 1982. So I'll stop here. Sorry for the confusion.
Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. You've been perfectly in time. Okay, Antonella, your turn.
Okay, thanks, Riccardo. Yes, here Riccardo said Riccardo, so it's a bit difficult. Okay, thank you, and thank you to Mark for his presentation. I haven't prepared PowerPoint, so I hope I will be clear enough, even without proper presentation, without the slides. I will start with a few things I meant to say about Garegnani, what I learned from him, and then maybe I will move a little bit now, or maybe in the second turn of presentation, on some of the stimulations from Mark. So the Garegnani was my first. I'm very pleased to participate, to contribute to this event in memory of Garegnani. Garegnani was my supervisor during my PhD, and he was also much later my colleague at Roma 3. And as I would say, all his students, I learned a lot from him, not only in terms of strictly contents of economics, but also, I would say, in a broader sense of how to approach economic analysis and being an economist. And I will try to say something about this, a bit scattered, but I think can be of interest for younger people. So I met Garegnani in person when he became my supervisor. I actually applied to La Sapienza because I wanted to work with him, but I had already met him in writings before that, when I was a student in Siena, an undergraduate student. And I would like also to say something about that, because okay, I was a young student, so I had studied microeconomics on a standard American textbook in my first year. In my second year, I had a course again on microeconomics and general equilibrium. And the book on general equilibrium was a book by Graziani, a textbook by Graziani. And then the book had at the end of each chapter a short commented bibliography. And one of these short commented bibliography said something about the capital controversy. And I can still remember being very happy that there was something wrong with that theory I had begun to study when preparing the course in microeconomics, because I didn't like it. I didn't find it convincing. I didn't like this preferences and choices between sugar and butter and so on. I didn't like the idea that these things were so important in determining the outcomes of a market economy, of a capitalist system. We were in the 70s, we had all of us had read a lot of Marxist stuff, consciously or unconsciously, had a different view of the world. But at the same time, I realized that if that was a theory, it was a theory of how the economic system works, and if it was a good theory, it had to be taken seriously. So I was very glad when I left that there had been some internal critique of the theory, so that it was not so sure that that was a good theory. So that was the first impact. And the second one was that later on during my studies, I read two contributions that were mentioned by Mark. The one was the Italian book Valore Domanda Effettiva, which more or less corresponds to the two papers published on the Cambridge Journal on consumption, investment, and effective demand. And the other book in Italian, which was on Marx e gli economisti classici, which more or less reproduces the article on Oxford Economic Papers on Marx and the classical economists. So these readings also were very important for me because although they were not easy readings in a sense for a student, still now they are not, but the effect they had on me was that I felt that they clarified a lot about what were the different approaches in economics and the different perspectives, which I've been reading somehow also in the preparation of my dissertation, but was not so able to classify in a clear way. So even for the purpose of classification of different views in economics, I think those contributions were very useful. And of course, Garegnani's contribution, Mark already listed the number of points. I would perhaps put them together in three, basically, strands or streams of contributions. One is, of course, the critique to neoclassical theory, that is the capital controversy, which went much beyond the 60s. Garegnani continued to write and discuss these topics till the end, basically, in the 20s. In the 2000s. And capital controversy was a critique to neoclassical theory as a complete, and at least in the intentions, then we can disagree about whether this is true and is a valid criticism, but the intention and the conclusions that were derived from the capital controversy were that the whole edifice was wrong. So it was not just a criticism to, not only a criticism to the use of the aggregate production function, but it was a criticism to the goodness of the analytical foundations of decreasing demand schedules for factors of production. So something which is at the very core, I would say, of everything in neoclassical theory, the theory of income distribution, of employment, and the reaching of equilibrium in a general sense. The other, and of course, if you criticize the edifice, then there must be something to put in its place. And so the other two major lines of contribution were aimed at contributing to fill this emptiness, once abandoning neoclassical theory. But of course, that could not be the work of a single individual. So it was, one had to look at the history of economic thought in search for alternatives, and those were found, of course, following also the contribution by Sraffa in the classical economists. So the attempt to deepen the knowledge of the contributions by the classical economists and clarify what was their analytical framework were part of this reconstructive or constructive work towards proposing an alternative to neoclassical theory. And the other thing, of course, still in this line of proposing an alternative, was the work on the principle of effective demand, which Garegnani in fact regarded as the only valid theory of output and employment we have once you get rid of the neoclassical theories. That's the only other theory of output we have, because of course the classics in this respect were not, did not have a proper theory of output. Many of them followed Say's law, and that was not acceptable after Keynes, precisely, or in modern economies anyway. So I think these are basically three interconnected lines of research. But before I move into that, and also into the fact that I don't find it all surprising that there is some path dependency in Garegnani, because once you believe that effective demand has an important role and that income distribution, it basically depends on social norms, institutions, and class conflict, then of course both of them, output and income distribution, are very much path dependent. So I think there has been some misunderstanding on Garegnani of what Garegnani was meaning, for example, when discussing long period and these sort of things. But I will go back to that maybe later. Just let me say a few words, if I still have a bit of time, about more broader issues about how to approach economics, which I think I understood from Garegnani. It's my interpretation, of course, but I think that there are some points I would like to recall. First of all, that I think he would very much emphasize that economic analysis and also critical discussions must be always developed with a lot of rigor, depth, and intellectual honesty. So when we discuss as academics, as economists, ideology or political inclinations must be kept as much as possible, as humanly possible, out of the picture. We have to be discussing in a scientific, rigorous way. And this means also that one should try to when discussing or criticizing another theory, never build straw men. One should always try to understand very well the theory or the analysis which one is criticizing, and always look for the best expression, the best exposition, the best scholars, and to discuss those contributions, the best contributions in the camp one wants to critically assess and discuss. And also that any scholar which is motivated by some kind of social or political passion should, precisely because of that, be as intellectually honest and rigorous as possible, because if you have a progressive stance, or if you want to somehow impact or change society, you have to know it very well. You must do your best to understand things very well, and not to, construct false pictures. And of course, economic theory must be discussed at various levels. An important one, of course, for Garegnani, as for Sraf, I should say, internal consistency is extremely important, so it should be always critically assessed. But also the consistency with fact, with empirical evidence, is very important, and also, of course, in this within this consistency with fact, the realism of assumption is also quite important. The other very important methodological lesson, I think, is that this is, of course, the result of looking at the classical economists, is the separation between different levels of analysis. what Garegnani used to call the distinction between the core and non-core, which has caused also a lot of misapprehensions. So I don't want to use those words. There are issues in economics where you need a logical deductive approach, so that in the end you can and often need to use formalized analysis. And this is, for example, the connection between distributive variables and relative prices. This is a very complicated interrelation, which needs to be discussed at a very abstract, logical and deductive level. On the other hand, there are different kinds of economic phenomena which are also very important, but cannot be analyzed at the same level, very abstract, deductive, but on the contrary, need to be analyzed. They are historic and specific to different periods, countries, institutions, and so on. So if you want to understand income distribution, for example, how the output is split between profits and wages or other components, then you have to you need a different level of analysis, which is less abstract and incorporates the observation of historical and institutional elements. So different levels of abstraction and hence separate analysis, which doesn't mean that there are mutual influences, but in a sense, you keep the analysis separate. And this is very much related to the idea that economists should proceed in their analysis as much as possible by means of short chains of reasoning. This was an idea that was already present in some classical economists, was also in Marshall, and Garegnani was a strong believer that one should try to stick to short chains of reasoning, because you cannot, which went together with this being very suspicious of too much modeling, formal modeling, no? Because formal modeling requires that you make a lot of assumptions about how the things are related, different variables are related. Often you need to make assumptions which can be manageable from the point of view of formal treatment or simple formal treatment, but which are not, for this reason, very realistic and so on. So very careful with formal modeling. And I think these are quite interesting insights about how to do economic theory. Then I don't know, I think I've spoken quite a lot, so maybe we can have another, I can go more into the content of Garegnani's contribution in the next, Riccardo, you tell me.
Yes, of course, I mean, yes. So let's say we'll leave the floor to Matthias, and then in the second round, also, when it will be the time of answering the questions, you will have the opportunity to dig deeper into what you were saying. Matthias, please.
Well, first of all, thank you to Riccardo for the invitation, and to the Italian Post-Keynesian Network for the invitation and for organizing this. I feel a little bit overwhelmed to be invited to talk about this. I think there are too many people that are far more knowledgeable and could provide insights on Garegnani. And I'm also the third one to start speaking, which I don't have a PowerPoint either. I always reminded of that little joke about power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt pointlessly. And so I'm going to try to not repeat myself to some extent, repeat what's been said both by Mark and by Antonella in very coherent sort of way. I will try to point some differences of my perhaps interpretation. I was preparing this, and I had 4 broad contributions, areas of contributions that Garegnani had sort of had significant work of himself, and then I remember that Fabio Petri, talking about people that would know considerably more than I do, had written the entry for the Palgrave, and he had also those in 4 categories, and I suppose I had that in the back of my mind without remembering. But my 4 categories, I'm happy to say, were very close to Petri's, and so I had it in the things on capital debates, in which I include this stuff on the change in the notion of equilibrium, effective demand, which he puts growth and effective demand in one category. I separated those because he has clarifications of Sraffa theory, and I have one that I don't think was brought, and that's why I started from here. I don't want to really discuss all of the categories. That was well done, but Marxism, and I think that's something that Mark said. Mark brought up his very good paper on whether Sraffians should be part of post-Keynesian economics, and earlier today we saw Chandni presenting a paper on new Ricardian contributions to the environment, a term that I'm not sure other Sraffians feel that way, but I feel not positive about. It's a term of derision. It was a term to be insulting, And here's something that I think it's important. Sraffians, and I see Sraffa and Garegnani as part of one big project, so they're a unit in that respect. Are one of the very few heterodox groups that are often discussed in terms of whether they should be part of Marxism. And these are not true Marxists, and they didn't really understand the importance of the labor theory of value, and hence they are Ricardian. And also there is this notion that, they're not really Keynesians. This effective demand thing, they didn't get it, and they didn't get this all uncertainty and expectations and historical time and all of these other things that are sort of incredibly important for the Keynes project. And I think that that's exactly where Garegnani is central. In demystifying those two views, I think that exactly the idea of what I should say, Franklin Serrano is not particularly fond of that term of classical Keynesianism. But so he prefers Sraffian, and but the idea of classical Keynesianism is exactly to bring those two things together, to bring the idea that the theory of value and distribution is central for any discussion of effective demand in the long run, and of course it's only in the long run that this matters. So if we're going to say something different, otherwise we end up with something that it's akin to neoclassical synthesis and short-term Keynesianism and so on and so forth. So in the way I see the importance of Garegnani is exactly similar to that. So I think that there are one can think of the ways of the criticism of that long period that goes from the 30s to the 60s, which is the period of that Shackle for the wrong reasons calls the years of high theory. Which are the years of high theory? It's the years in which there is an intent, in my view, in my sort of view, I describe the history of thought increasingly in my courses, I should say, of 4 broad periods, of history of thought. So the first great period of the rise of classical political economy is the period in which you have a view. I tend to emphasize the relevance of policy and theory together, and so in the first period you have a policy of laissez-faire, but coached with a theory that does not presuppose that markets are self-adjusted to positions of optimal, utilization of resources, particularly labor. Then you move through a vulgar era in which there is no theory of how exactly the laissez-faire would lead to optimal outcomes, but there is a belief in this optimal outcome. There is then the rise of marginalism, which it took me a long while to, first notice this. But the vast majority of marginalists, including in the place where they were, the central sort of strand of marginalism, which was at Cambridge, and Marshall and Pigou, and then of course Sidgwick, that they were not for laissez-faire. They were perfectly fine with the notion that intervention was necessary because market imperfections were common. So some degree of government intervention was necessary because of these market imperfections. But they did think that the market economy did produce efficient outcomes. And then the years of high theory, exactly the period in which it started with Sraffa's criticism of Marshall, and then with Keynes' criticism of Say's law. And of course, Sraffa will build into the whole, and evolve into a critique of marginalist theory in general, theory of value and distribution, and abandon any Marshallian sort of supply and demand concepts. It's a period in which you have actually the conjunction of, another sort of, it's the economy does not produce optimal efficient outcomes, and you don't have, of course, any need of laissez-faire because, government can actively improve the situation in the economy. And the neoliberal vulgar era is exactly the reversal of this. We have now a theory, that suggests that the economy, as a result of the capital debate. So I think that that's an important thing that Garegnani was central in emphasizing with his 76 paper, one of his most important papers, in my view, in suggesting exactly that that there is this scape towards the intertemporal approach, and a lot of his work in his later years was in trying to, I think, rethink why the intertemporal approach is problematic. But this view in which you have really that the system is both self-adjusted to optimal levels and laissez-faire is better. And now it is because, yes, sure, there might be market imperfections, but government imperfections are much worse. And so that's where we are. And Garegnani is important in that because, while Sraffa certainly, I mean, you can think of Keynes and Sraffa. Keynes is going against Say's law directly, the idea that savings, that investment adjusts the full employment savings, through some mechanism. And Keynes, I would agree with Garegnani that there are issues in Keynes' solution of that problem. But Keynes goes about that sort of strand of the theory, whereas Sraffa, if you think of his early work up to the his transition, what he's trying to do up to the production of commodities, trying to show that the marginalist theory distribution doesn't work. But I think that the connection, it's made clear by Garegnani again, although I think Sraffa knew about this, that those two criticisms, the two routes, if you want to criticize, to use a Garegnani term, two routes to effective demand, the two routes here to criticize marginalism lead to the same place, because you do need to get rid of marginalism in order to criticize Say's law. So I think that's a central sort of contribution of Garegnani. But here, if I may, I want to say, so I'm going to escape a little bit of what I think are his contributions. I should say one more thing before I go there. If I don't have time, Ricardo, you stop me and I'll bring back some of this stuff in my next intervention. I should say I do have the little thing of when Garegnani went to the New School in 97, 98, I don't know, and gave a talk there, and I still kept it in my copy. It was translated into Spanish too, so I have my little copy of his dissertation that I ran long ago. I also, I read him way before I ever met him, and when I met him, we talked a lot about Celso Furtado, and I think a lot of Celso Furtado he spoke very fondly of Celso Furtado. Celso Furtado was writing at Cambridge the classic book on Brazilian development, and one of the key books on Latin American structuralism exactly at that point. And with qualms that one might have about Furtado's particular theoretical perspectives, I think that the project is the same, is to revive the ideas of Marx. When we say revive surplus approach and revive classical political economy, revive the ideas of Marx. What Sraffa did is to make Marx relevant, and that's what Garegnani was about too. And he makes Marx relevant at the same time that wanted to move these ideas of Marx to think about in the context in which demand is what drives the system in the short and in the long run. So it's this conjunction of Marx and Keynes, Marx and Kalecki, that is central to the project. And so I see that, the only thing that I would add, I think, is lacking in the Italian tradition, Italian Cambridge tradition of this, is which was in the Latin American structuralist tradition, is this notion that but I don't think it lacks in the sense that they didn't, it's not developed in the same way for obvious reasons, because both England and Italy are at the center of the development of capitalism, whereas Latin America is in the periphery. So this notion of the peripheral aspects and the differences, but so I think that's sort of an interesting addition to that discussion. But exactly, that's why I was going to talk about something else, and I brought Furtado, because I think one of the things that I think it's a great misconception about this project, in particular in the view of post-Keynesians. And I say this with great respect because, Mark is one of those authors like Garegnani, like Franklin Serrano, like many others that I wasn't directly a student of, but they are almost like, my teachers in many ways. I've read them carefully. I have great respect. I've been heavily influenced by their thought and was lucky to talk to many of them and so on and so forth. But, is this notion that there is something important and distinctive about historical time that can be separated from the logical analysis and criticism of the labor theory, of the theory of value. And I think that there are just two theories of value. And the theory of value is necessary. And you either end up with some version, there's several versions of the classical surplus approach to value and distribution, or you end up, and I should say there is a great degree of confusion on this, or you end up with some version, vulgar or not, of the marginalist theory of value and distribution. I think that one of the appeals of the intertemporal approach is that exactly because it avoids issues of the uniform rate of profit, because they have the several types of capital in physical terms, or in different ways, but and every single one of the settings of the model is a solution on itself. It eliminates the notion of a tendency to the long run, so it's a short run model all the time. This has been surprisingly interpreted by many heterodox people, and I think post-Keynesians in particular, and I think Joan Robinson here was insidious and negative. I don't think she thought this, but her interpretation has led to this view that you get in historical time, and that this neoclassicals are in a sense more modern and understand better because you have multiple equilibrium and possibilities of instability and things that are sort of cast away supposedly in classical political economy, which is not true. So classical political economy has perfectly all right in dealing with issues of history and institutions. So the whole point of the classical approach, Adam Smith is trying to explain the wealth of nations in a process that it's historical, in which you do have, of course, natural prices, call it whatever you want, natural production, normal prices, just prices, equilibrium ones, because you need to say something about the rate of profit and surplus. This surplus that is very well understood by all the other social scientists. They do think in terms, anthropologists, sociologists, all of these guys, when they go back, they look at the surplus approach as the basis of the origins of the social sciences in the 18th century. Sergio and Stefano had published a paper recently on this. It's in the Centro Srafa, which I recommend that everybody reads. I might have some differences on their sort of too generous description of Polanyi, but fair enough. Polanyi was an Austrian economist, and so there are problems with some of his Austrian views in terms of value and distribution. But at any rate, all of these things are absolutely perfectly compatible with classical political economy, with the idea that they're trying to discuss exactly the complexities of history and institutions in promoting the process of growth, but you have to have some analytical framework that allows you to talk about this. So the idea that we can have historical discussion without a clear analytical understanding of the core of the functioning of the economy seems to me, very problematic. And I think that Garegnani was central in clarifying this idea of the core. His paper, 84 paper on Marx and classical political economy, it's where the famous schematic sort of appears very clearly. I still use that with my undergraduate students. And it's the sort of thing that helps clarify, I think, some of these confusions, I think, in what sense then Sraffians are part of this revival of Marx, and in fact, the ones, in my view, pushing a coherent interpretation of how to advance Keynesian and Kaleckian ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank to the three of you. Okay, for the second round, first of all, I would like to ask you, if you want, of course, to comment on the other two contributions of the roundtable participant. So, I mean, it's up to you if you want. Then I have also a couple of very brief questions for you that I would like to share. So the first one is the following one. There is the general perception, I would say, that Sraffa and Garegnani have provided a very strong critical apparatus of neoclassical theory. Still, when it comes to the propositive side, to the constructive side, their contribution and the contribution of the scholars working in this tradition has been to some extent lighter. So my question to you will be, which is your assessment of the current relevance of contribution of scholars who base their work and model their work out of the contribution of Sraffa and Garegnani? In a sense, I have a second question strictly related to the first one. I assume that all the people participating in this conversation are more or less completely persuaded that Sraffa and Garegnani not argued, but proved that neoclassical economics is wrong, actually. Simply doesn't work from a logical point of view. Still, it looks like that neoclassical economics is not that affected by this aspect of the story. So my perhaps silly question to you, but I mean, it's a silly question, but this is an aspect that really bothers me and troubles me, is what do we do? Once we have proved that the neoclassicals are wrong, and the neoclassical really don't care that much about that. So what can we do, and what should we do, and what to do next? Okay, this is it. I propose perhaps to shuffle the order of intervention. So why don't
if you
we
want,
go
I can
with...
go very briefly first, and so that they have, because I was the last, so people may want to respond.
Sure, absolutely. So let's go with Matthias, Mark, and then Antonella.
I'll be very brief. So I think that there's a lot of work that it's good and relevant. I take seriously Mark's view of the Great Tent. You know, I might have. I never write the paper, but my notes. I'm not Sraffa, but I have my notes. Perhaps in 30 years I'll publish a paper on the Great Tent. So I think the Great Tent is, you know, so I write, I think heterodox economics is the tent, and heterodox economics has two propositions for me. One is distribution is conflictive, and second one is effective demand matters in the long run. And that's a minimal program. And I think that there are many ways in which you can accept some of those things. So I'm always say I'm happy to accept that there are many post-Keynesians that think in terms of some version of markup theories and this, that, and the other. I don't think that there are a solution for the problem of value and distribution, but I think that in general, in spirit, in the same tradition of trying to say, you know, there's all this stuff. There's a discussion between Kaleckians and super multiplier, Sraffians. I use the term Kaldorians. Sometimes there is the, sort of other stuff. Kaldor is the first heterodox person to use the super multiplier, but that's another story. And there might be differences of how we think that capacity adjusts to long-term demand and so on and so forth. But we're on the same page. It's a demand-driven system. So I think that the Great Tent is there in heterodox economics, and I'm all for that. And I think that there is a lot of stuff that it's being done under those. So I have no. I think that is alive and kicking. And I was once invited at my alma mater at the New School to discuss some of these issues with graduate students, and they asked me what's the role of a place like the New School. It's the production of heterodox economists by heterodox economists. So we reproduce ourselves, and by reproducing ourselves, we keep this program alive. I think we're better now than we were ages ago. So think of this. I always say my example, because my students tend to think that I'm pessimistic about the future. Think of this. Marx read alone the classical authors, and while everybody was vulgar economics, nobody understood what Ricardo said, in the famous phrase of Sraffa, he understood it alone. It's so Sraffa sits there in Marshall Library and go to edit Ricardo's works, and nobody had understood what the classical authors said, although it was written in plain English, and he discovers. Now we have a community, and there are many manuals, and we publish, and we have this sort of gatherings. So I think that that's so what you described, it's very, Ricardo, so you said marginalism does not work. We know there are many different ways. I mean, again, we might have slight differences of, history, equilibrium, this, that, and the other, but we agree on that. So, and who changed it, and who was more determinant in proving that. I would agree with you. I think that Sraf and Garegnani are central in that project, but we do agree. And then they go, first of all, they were affected. So neoclassical economics has changed as a result of the onslaught of the capital debates. So they were forced. So the change in the notion of equilibrium is because the capital debates proved that the aggregative model does not work. And yet, when they go talk about policy, they do talk and use, the IMF doesn't use the intertemporal model. They think in terms of the regular, aggregative model. And that's what they do when they go to Argentina and to all of the other countries. So in my view, what you have is organized hypocrisy. So I have a paper exactly on that. So I think that what do you do when you're proven wrong? And and this goes to Mark's point on Felipe and Macombi, just to say something that Felipe always says, that when he presents this to neoclassical people, they say, oh, yeah, it makes sense. And then what do? Well, they do what any rational person would do when proven wrong and have no solution for the problem. They act as if they didn't never heard that before and continue to, and they plow through. So that's exactly what they do. So what do? We do the same. I mean, we're never going to be dominant. So if the notion is that neoclassical economics will drop out of the, picture and some version of of heterodox economics, let alone some version of classical Keynesian, will become dominant, I think we're in this for the wrong reasons. I think that, ideology and power play a very important role in all of this. So I think what we do is we form people. We form people, as Antonella was saying, in the lines of what Garegnani said, thinking logically through things, because new sort of wrenches will be thrown into our sort of analysis, and new neoclassical vulgar economics will appear. So we need to rigorously analyze the assumptions, get to the conclusions, show the limitations, do the work that was presented this morning, the empirical work of looking at the actual institutional factors that, in historical events that prove why neoclassical economics doesn't work. And so, that's where we go. We continue doing what we do.
Thank you, Matthias. Really, thank you. Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll start with some remarks about what Antonella said. In particular, mentioning that Garegnani has been misunderstood by the other post-Keynesians. And I think this is true. I think in particular, his view of the core has been misunderstood. Of course, I think the reason for which Garegnani emphasized the core, which is basically pricing theory, is because he thought something rigorous could be said about it, whereas he thought that talking about effective demand and the output side was much more complicated. So I don't think he ever said that the core was the most important issue. On the contrary, I think he was saying that it's the other side, the output or effective demand side, which was most important. But it was much more, rigor could not be given to it as much as for the pricing core. Antonella also mentioned, how should we deal with other theories, emphasizing that Garegnani had given ways to deal with that, and in particular, not to deal with the straw man. And I would go even further. I would say that if we are to look at what other theories are saying on a particular topic, then our duty is to try to take the best out of that, not necessarily criticizing it, because we are sometimes outsiders versus this theory. So we don't necessarily understand all the complexities of it, but at least we can certainly take the good features of this theory. By the way, I would like to point to a book that has been written by 3 Japanese colleagues, the main author being Shiozawa, and they published a book last year called Foundations of Evolutionary Economics, but really it's a kind of Straffian work, and in particular Shiozawa has written about Straffian economics. And I did a book review of this in the Review of Evolutionary Political Economy of 2020 in the issue number 2. So it's a long book review, maybe 6 or 7 pages. So if you don't have the courage to go and find the book, which has something like 300 or 400 pages, then at least you can. But I thought it was very interesting because their main point was that the capitalist system can work even though prices do not react to discrepancies between supply and demand, thanks to rates of capacity utilization, which are flexible, and thanks to inventories. And so they model in a mathematical way, there's no simulations, how the system can adjust despite the fact that prices only react to changes in technology, not to changes in supply and demand. So I think there's a lot of relationship with Straffian ideas here. Yeah, about what Matthias said on historical time and logical time, I tend to blame really Eatwell and Millgate. I have the impression that Eatwell and Millgate presented a version of Straffian economics which was really extreme, which those like Roncaglia or those closer to Garegnani or even Pasinetti did not have such a vision. I mean, for them, you know, the only important thing was the long run. And I don't think this was the view of you know, what Matthias called the classical Keynesians, or what Dutt and Amadeo were calling the neo-Ricardian Keynesians. And by the way, with respect to Marx, it seems to me that the natural prices of Pasinetti are, in fact, the correct theory of value. And again, in an agent-based model that I did with Pascal Sepéché, a French specialist of agent-based models, where in this case, firms were reacting to a fall in demand or by changing their prices. In the end, the model was always stabilizing towards prices that were Pasinetti prices, meaning that they were equal to the direct, indirect, and hyper-indirect sum of the labor coefficients. Now, to come to Ricardo's difficult question, yeah, the neoclassicals, you can prove them wrong as much as you want. It's not gonna, they're not gonna change their ways. The constructive side is the most important, I think, at least at this stage. And I think this is what post-Keynesians do. You know, sometimes I get very much annoyed reading people in the philosophy of economics or philosophy of science. It seems to me these people haven't read anything that has been published over the past 20 years, or haven't been to any conferences that we have had for the last 20 years. And in particular, I don't know if you read this paper that came out from the New School which was about the future of heterodox economics or something like that. And I got exactly this impression. And
you mean the Ingrid Kvangren and Carolina Alves, that thing?
No, no, it was from the New School.
Ingrid was at the New School at some point.
It was Will Milberg and 2 or 3 other people. And I thought, wow, if this is the way the New School is going, poor Mark Setterfield, what is he going to be able to do against these guys? And again, I had the impression that they hadn't been to any of our conferences. And well, to show some optimism, maybe not the Straussian ideas specifically, but I think the post-Keynesian ideas in general, I think have some impact right now. Just look at how governments are acting with respect to deficits. And the central banks, I mean, there are many central bankers who now cite works on endogenous money. And the European Commission is now having a survey wondering whether they should change some of their rules, you know, those Maastricht rules which are being imposed on the countries of the European Union and those of the Eurozone. I don't know where it will go, but it seems that this is somehow the result of at least Keynesian ideas in general. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Please, Antonella, you have the honor to conclude the second round.
Yes, there are a lot of issues, and I don't think I will try to be reasonably orderly, and of course I will not be able to discuss all the questions that have emerged. I think this, just a few words, because of course it's an analytical question that cannot be solved nor deeply discussed here, although it would be nice to have some workshops, maybe among different strands of post-Keynesians about competition, profit rate, uniformity, the long run, and all these things about it, which means in fact about the theory of relative prices and how they relate to distribution and the rate of profit. Just a few observations. I think that some perplexities or diffidence from post-Keynesians to the issue of the tendency to, let's say, long period normal prices, relative prices, and uniform rate of profits may be justified by the fact that some of the formal analysis that have been developed of this issue, in fact, have used have had actually some sort of neoclassical flavor, because they had, for example, some sort of demand curves, demand depending on prices, etc., which of course I would regard as not very good assumptions, and this may have led to see this question as if it was framed in the same way as in neoclassical theory. But if we look at the substance of the issue, the ultimate meaning of this tendency, long period tendency to uniform rate of profits, basically the idea behind it is an idea which seems to be widely shared among economists. That is to say that if there are changes in the composition of demand, we are not talking about the aggregate level, but the composition of demand, then in a market economy, in a capitalist economy, there will be also a tendency of the composition of production to change and tend to adjust to the changes in demand. Now, the classics thought that this would happen because there would be a deviation, let's say, of profit rates from the normal one, and this would push capitalists to move capital between different sectors of production. which may be still seen as a channel, but there may be other ways, quantities adjusting even without the prices, relative prices changing in the process, depending on the type of production, of type of market, industry, and so on. But I think ultimately the idea is that there is, in capitalism, there is mobility of capital, and there is a tendency of the composition of production to adjust to the composition of demand, which seems to be a very basic sort of view that is hard to criticize, no? Even if we don't believe that even classical competition prevails, because there are obstacles to the mobility of capital across industries, for example, yet we would think that even in imperfect competition, firms would eventually tend to adjust to their productions to the level of demand for the various products. So I think, but I think that we would need to discuss this more to understand what are the problems and the mutual diffidences, let's say, around this question of the uniform rate of profit and the idea of the long run prices. On the other hand, I wanted to say a bit more about the research project around the principle of effective demand, because there is a little bit of history of the development of ideas in Garegnani, which is less known for good reasons to foreigners than to Italians, because things were published in Italian first, and many of them were never published in English, or were published in English very late, like the paper Mark was mentioning in Review of Political Economy in 2015. So I think it may be interesting to know that when Garegnani began to work at this idea on effective demand and growth and so on, he was a young then researcher in the 60s at Svimez, which was an institution dealing important Italian institutions which worked many important economists at the time, and it was meant to elaborate research and policy proposals for the development of the south of Italy. And the published papers by Garegnani, the ones of Cambridge Journal on consumption, investment, and effective demand, actually were the theoretical part, a development of a theoretical part of the work he did there at Svimez, which was meant to address a specific question, which is still very relevant, I think, in the debate today, which was the distinction that was accepted then at the time in Italy, but also elsewhere, between, let's say, Keynesian unemployment and structural unemployment. So Keynesian unemployment was the kind of unemployment you found in mature economies which had a large endowment of productive capacity, of physical capital, and which could be explained by a lack of effective demand and consequent underutilization of the existing capital stock. That was Keynesian unemployment that could be cured with injection of demand, okay, with Keynesian policies, expansionary policies. But then this was regarded as different and distinct from a structural unemployment, such as the one that was believed to exist in the south of Italy, which was due to underdevelopment, to a lack of physical capacity, which then could not be classified as Keynesian unemployment and cured with expansion of demand, because the cure had to be building up the capacity, the capital infrastructure, the physical capital. And that required, in order to be possible, a compression, a reduction of consumption, in order to make room for investment, which also translated as a policy proposal in reduction, or at least keep low wages or reducing real wages, in order to be able to expand investment. So the the sense of the research by Garegnani was overcoming this distinction and showing that, in fact, even in an economy like the southern regions of Italy, where there was indeed a structural lack of physical capital, more aggregate demand was possibly the cure, the policy to be advanced, because you had to make sure that if investment were there to build up an increasing capacity, there had to be enough demand to justify those investments. So the two problems were not separated, but they were complementary. So you needed aggregate demand to make sure that investment would find then a justification in the growth of demand. And the idea that there was flexibility in the degree of utilization of existing capacity meant that you could increase at the same time both consumption and investment. So you could increase wages in order to keep up consumption, and at the same time to have more investment and more capital accumulation. So those were the basic questions that then were developed analytically by looking at the principle of effective demand in Keynes, and then with the hints Garegnani gave to the idea that investments are largely induced, and that this is the consequence of the fact that the principle of effective demand holds, and the degree of capacity utilization can change for long periods of time, can be different from normal for periods long enough to then push firms to invest or disinvest according to which is the case, overutilization or underutilization. So I think those ideas you know, at their origin, a very interesting question, which is still valid because this distinction between structural and Keynesian unemployment is still very much around today, and of course is overcome in the literature which is developing in the post-Keynesian camp about demand-led growth. So to go back to perhaps also some of the questions raised by Riccardo. I think that on the constructive side, there have been contributions, both by Sraffians, say, and other non-mainstream economists that go in constructive direction, particularly if we think of the many studies that have been done about the changes in income distribution, functional income distributions in the last decades. I think that the kind of explanation that have been advanced and also supported by empirical research go very much in the direction of the classical view about income distribution, that is that institutions matter, unemployment matters, you know, the bargaining strength of the parties is that it's very much at the basis of changes in income distribution, and of course this may be influenced by various factors and in different degrees in different countries and political and institutional setting. The other broad field in which there has been a lot of development, I think, is on the, as I said, on demand-led growth, so a lot of contributions showing that effective demand matters also in the long run, both in terms of output and employment determination, in terms of building up capacity and with the long run effects, and also there is an impact on productivity. So I think there are various contributions along these lines which are important. I think there are still a couple of fields in which would be useful to have more discussion and clarification even within the post-Keynesian or heterodox camp in general. One of them is the determinants of investments. And so the contribution by Daniele Girardi was very interesting in that respect. And the other one, as I said, is what determines the rate of profits. And in a sense the markup, if you want to talk about the markup on costs. These two areas, I think, we should discuss more, but I'm also confident that let's say, the areas in which there is a certain convergence of ideas and results also of empirical research are widening, and also I would be confident, I mean, I'm optimistic about the fact that there is an increase of interest on the part of young students and scholars in the, non-mainstream approaches. And what will be in the future, we don't know. But certainly Garegnani will have contributed a lot with this work to the development of this field of study.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have, let's say, half an hour on our originally proposed schedule. So I will open the floor to the general audience if they have comments, questions, doubts, pretty. Any voluntary?
Well, if I may just say one thing, I have the feeling that there is much more disagreement between heterodox economists on the deficiencies of neoclassical theory. And I think there is much more agreement on what the alternative is. I mean, very broadly speaking, I mean, coming back to what Antonella just said about effective demand and all that.
There was a very lively debate on the chat of Google Meet as well, related on structuralism development. Okay, so do we have any comments or questions? Please, Matthias, I see your.
Well, if nobody's saying something, I just wanted to say something about Mark's notion that Sheikh's criticism of the production function and Felipe's and Macambe's book, but Jesus has been writing on this for quite a bit. For a while, it is more important in a sense than the capital debate. And I do think that he's right in the sense that it has become more important in the sense that it's more relevant. So people pay more attention within heterodox economics. But I do think that in terms of, because the capital debate is not just about the aggregative model and that there is no, relationship between the interest rate and the intensity of the use of capital, factor of production, and so on and so forth. Which is extremely relevant if you think about the resurgence. I mean, neoclassical economists, the vulgar economics is something interesting. How long it takes for them to reassert certain things. The term natural rate of interest had vanished. You have it back there in the 30s, and then even though Keynes' criticism is problematic, it does vanish from the record. There is no discussion of a natural rate of interest almost in any sort of serious place for the longest while. Friedman doesn't even bring it back as a concept. He says Wixel has that concept of the natural rate of interest. Here's this other concept, the natural rate of unemployment. And that dominates all of the discussions in macro for the longest while. It's only the 2000s that they start estimating this stuff, and they bring it back, and everybody now talks about the natural rate of interest. There's no, you can read a book by Goodhart on the great demographic reversal, and he's moving savings and investment curves here and there to tell you what's happening with the natural rate of interest. So the cat is out of bag. They have gone back to the use of that. So it's not just that, because that undermines all of that argument. I think more important is it's the sort of when there is an element that I think it's central to Garegnani's legacy. Garegnani is the person where I finally understood neoclassical economics, not because of the manuals in neoclassical economics that I read. They're utterly confusing, and my neoclassical teachers were confused and confusing about this. And Garegnani is the one that clearly explains what neoclassical economics is about. So most, I'll give you an example. Austrians Austrians think that they have a theory of the rate of interest that it's purely subjective, that doesn't require any discussion of capital, and hence it's not open to the capital debates. It's fantastic, the degree of confusion that you have out there. They think they're not even marginalists. So part of the point is that I think that the capital debates remain central and should be part of the discussion of what we teach when we reproduce ourselves, because it's central to understand what neoclassical economics is all about, which I think most neoclassical economists don't understand. I have lots of colleagues that think of themselves as being heterodox. They say, oh, because I do behavioral finance or, whatever it is that they're doing. And so, neoclassical economists these days don't know what neoclassical economics is. It's dying within neoclassical economics. Daniele Girardi is, I don't know if he's still around, but we had once, I think, a conversation about the empirical turn in economics, and I think there are good things in the empirical turn that you can get in, which in my view is part of this vulgar economics. And sorry, I'm going, but last thing, it's I think that this empirical turn, you can get a lot of information about stuff from neoclassical economics, but it also reflects this utter confusion of neoclassical economics. And I think for that reason, I think the reservoir of understanding of neoclassical economics these days remains within heterodox economics, for what's worth. So that would be a reason to think that the original discussion of the capital debates and re-switching and reverse capital deepening and all of those things are central to be taught and understood.
Thank you, Matthias. Do we have any comment from the audience? Otherwise, we can call the day. It was a very long and thrilling day, hoping that you enjoyed it as much as we did. Okay, and meanwhile, before we conclude, let me just spend a few words about the next events we are organizing as the Italian Post-Keynesian Networks. So the next one is on the 16th of December. There will be an online seminar with presentation of 2 articles by Daniela Cialfi and Lorenzo Tonni, 2 young scholars. Then in January, we are organizing an online event on cryptocurrencies, and then we have many more other events forthcoming, the presentation of the new book by Sergio Cesaratto on monetary policy, but you can find all the updates on the Facebook webpage of the Italian Post-Keynesian Network. We also have an internet page that will be out in the next week. So follow our updates. We hope to see you soon with us again. Okay, so I wish you a pleasant evening or afternoon, depending on your time zone. And Mark.
Yeah, I'd just like to congratulate the organizers for organizing this Post-Keynesian Italian network, because I believe, although I have not been very active in doing so, but I believe institutions are very important for the future of heterodox economics and also for the students who go into heterodox economics. So again, congratulations for setting up these webinars and the organization, the network.
Okay, there is also a YouTube page we have where you can find all the past events. Okay, some of those are in English, some of those are in Italian, but check it out.
I was asked if it was recorded. So if it was recorded, put the link over there.
I think the recorded version can be found on the Facebook page of the IPKN. So it will be available there starting from the next hours.
But we will put also on YouTube later on.
Thank you.
Okay. Very well. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody. Nice seeing you guys.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.